Okay, in in this section, I would like to talk about rangelands across the world in North America and Alaska. And why do I want to talk about rangelands in a course about domestic ungulates? Why did humans domesticate ungulates in the first place? Well, it was to convert vegetation into something we could eat, meat and milk. With the development of agriculture, we domesticated plants, cereal grains and whatnot that we could consume directly. But there are huge tracts of land out there with vegetation that we cannot consume and get anything out of that. And we call that rangelands. And rangelands are areas, they're not under pasture or under any crops. They're native indigenous vegetation. There's various reasons why they haven't been developed as pasture or croplands, and it's either low precipitation or very rough topography, or it's very cold, or it's just not very remote. It's just not very easy to cultivate crops or develop it into pasture. And so we have these huge tracts of land, and so how can we use these huge tracts of land with this tremendous amount of vegetation and actually for the benefit of humans? Well, we use these rangelands as forage for both wildlife and for domestic animals. And there's a number of different types of rangelands across the world. There's tall grass and short grass prairie. Deserts make up a lot of our rangelands, and shrublands, woodlands, and there's huge tracts of steppes in Asia that are considered rangelands. And my favorite type of rangeland, which is tundra, which we have here in Alaska. And most people don't consider, when we speak of rangeland, tundra does not come to mind, but in Alaska it is a very important rangeland for both wildlife and domestic animals. But let's not confuse the terms range and rangeland. Rangeland isn't used specifically just for the grazing of domestic livestock. Rangeland has multiple uses by humanity. It's used as a source of recreation. It is used as a source of forage for domestic animals and livestock. We get water and minerals and wood fiber fuels, and quite a rangeland is used for a diversity of purposes for the benefit of mankind. So rangelands constitute about half the Earth's land surface. So there is a tremendous amount of rangeland across the world. And we humans domesticated animals to take advantage of these huge tracts of rangeland across the world. In North America, we have a real diversity of rangeland. We have the tundra rangelands up to the north. We have these beautiful short grass and long grass prairie rangelands in the Midwest. We have some saltbrush communities in the southwest North America, or Southwest America, that are used as rangelands. And a lot of the desert actually is used for the grazing of livestock and for wildlife. Alaska has a tremendous amount of rangeland. We actually have 350,000 square miles of potential rangeland. Much of this rangeland is very unique to northern ecosystems, and it's a tundra rangeland, even though we have some very beautiful grasslands. Maybe 150,000 square miles of grasslands in south central Alaska and along the Aleutian Islands. Historically, the management of these rangelands there's a lot of history associated with management of these grazing lands. Most of the rangelands in Alaska is dedicated to the grazing of wildlife, but historically some of it has been used for the grazing of livestock. Back in the 1890s, we introduced reindeer to Alaska, and we're going to talk about this introduction and the reindeer industry in great detail later in the course. But we introduced reindeer, about 1,200 reindeer, in 1892 through 1896, and the reindeer did very well. The population expanded greatly to hundreds of thousands of animals in the early 1900s. The reindeer were owned by different groups, actually 4 different groups. They were owned by non-natives, which included Sami reindeer herders. There was Alaskan native owners of reindeer. The missions owned reindeer and were using the grazing rangelands, and the U.S. government owned reindeer. So you had all these owners, producers, trying to use a common rangeland. And we had, of course, the tragedy of the commons. Everybody was trying to use a common grazing area and using up the range resources before their neighbor could. And this caused a lot of conflict between there was one group, the Lomans, who had a lot of reindeer, and they were monopolizing a lot of the grazing ranges, and they were a non-native group, and reindeer were originally introduced to help native Alaskans, so it produced a lot of conflict. So to resolve this conflict, it took an act of Congress. Congress passed the Alaska Grazing Act of 1927. What this act did was it allowed the Secretary of the Interior to establish grazing districts, reindeer ranges, and then issue grazing permits to the federal land, in federal grazing land in Alaska. But if you look at the Alaskan Grazing Act of 1927, which is still in effect today, preference was given to Alaskan natives because at the time there was just reindeer were the primary livestock in Alaska at the time. And later in the course, you will discuss with other members in the course the implications of the 1927 Alaska Grazing Act. Well, in the U.S., there's a very colorful and not a very rosy story as well about grazing lands in the U.S. Before the Civil War, the primary meat in our diet was pork, because before the Civil War we didn't have a very good transportation system, and so we couldn't transport food from raised and processed in one area and ship it to another area. We just didn't have the transportation infrastructure. But after the Civil War, we developed a railroad infrastructure. We laid tracks through the United States, and we developed refrigeration cars. So all of a sudden, you could ship food raised in one area to another. Now, these isolated federal rangelands in Western and Central America could be utilized to feed the majority of the country. Before the Civil War, the preferred meat was pork, salted pork. But after the development of refrigerated rail cars, the preference for meat in our diet changed to beef, transitioned over to beef. And so we began to use the federal grazing lands in Western and Middle America quite extensively. There is a lot of cattle owners, a lot of cattle producers, and again, it was the tragedy of the commons. You had a lot of owners trying to use a common grazing area, and we have a whole genre of movies, the Western movies based on this wild, conflicted time. We developed barbed wire. Some cattle owners, producers tried to keep other cattle owners out with barbed wire, and there's cutting of fences, and people were shooting each other and shooting each other's cattle. And so again, there was a lot of conflict, and so and along with the drought and the Great Depression, we needed a legislative solution. And using the 1927 Grazing Act of Alaska as a model, a representative from Colorado, Edward Taylor, he introduced a bill to set up grazing districts and issue grazing permits on federal land, much like Congress did for Alaska in 1927. And the Taylor Act authorized the withdrawal of federal lands and withdraw them and establish grazing districts. We set up these grazing ranges, and we established a bureau to manage these grazing ranges under the Department of Interior. At first, it was referred to called the Grazing Service, but later it was merged with the General Land Office to form the Bureau of Land Management. So the Taylor Act authorized the Bureau of Land Management to designate and issue permits on federal grazing lands in the western U.S. and the Midwest. And this was done to protect the range resources and to avoid what happened during the Dust Bowl. The vegetation was overgrazed. There was a lot of erosion, wind and water erosion, and so it's been a very useful tool to manage use of the rangeland. Today, the Bureau of Land Management manages about 170 million acres in the contiguous 48 states, and most of it is in the western states, and virtually every acre is now under permit for grazing of livestock. In Alaska, the Bureau of Land Management manages 86 million acres. The Bureau of Land Management issues grazing permits for land under their management, but also the state of Alaska also issues grazing permits on state lands as well. Most of these grazing permits are designated for the grazing of reindeer. There is 15 to 16 million acres of federal, state, and private land, primarily on the Seward Peninsula, that is designated as reindeer ranges, and grazing permits are issued to individuals or corporations for exclusive grazing rights on these permitted areas.